Hey, everybody. Hello. Hi. I'm Jennifer. I work here. Welcome. Thanks for coming out. How many of you are here in the green space for the first time in your lives? Wow. Awesome. How'd you hear about this? Just giggling. Okay, I mean, I was genuinely curious, but we don't have to talk. It's okay. You can find me after the show and tell me later. Well, I'm glad you found your way here. The Green Space is a part of New York Public Radio, WNYC and WQXR. So we gather people here to have conversations, play music, make art, and we make audio, obviously, in here, radio and podcasts. So I hope you will come back. And we also like to drink cocktails. Is there cocktails tonight? Did you get a cocktail? Did anyone try the special cocktail? No? No one got the special cocktail? It's Two Dope Queens inspired, you guys. All right, forget it. You should get one. They're really good. Your drink purchases are a really creative way to support independent journalism here at WNYC. Yeah, now you're into it. Yeah, it's fact-based reality, one cocktail at a time. Any members of WNYC or WQXR? Yeah, cool. I like that you wooed, but in this really quiet public radio way. Thank you so much for supporting us. Also, the Jerome L. Green Foundation, and also to all the New York Times subscribers in the house. There are many of you, right? New York Timesy? Yeah. Okay. So thanks to you all. Are you guys both New York Times subscribers and members of WNYC? It's like double dosing on journalism. That's great. You can't OD. Thanks also to Beth and Samantha and everyone on the New York Times team for bringing this show here. So we do about 10 events in the green space every month. I hope you'll come back, check them out. Every Monday night we do podcast and podcast adjacent, as this show is, programming. Next Monday we have Full Disclosure, hosted by Robin Farzad, taping an episode here. Brian Lehrer is going to do a live broadcast here tomorrow. He does that once every month. And we have lots of classical music and other stuff going on. So if you want to find out about it, just sign up for our newsletter and you will be the first to know about all these lively things. But right now, the main thing to do is to silence everything you have that might ring during the show. You can leave your phones on, of course, if you want to do some subtle tweeting. That is most welcome. And the whole show is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. So if you want to go back and share it later or look for a part that you liked a lot, that'll all be online on demand. So you ready to make some stuff happen? Ready to get this going? All right, I'm going to turn it over to the Senior Manager for Events Marketing at the New York Times, Beth Weinstein.
Hi, everybody. My name is Beth Weinstein. I'm so happy to welcome you here. I develop events for subscribers, and I'm very happy that everyone is here for Do You Believe Me Now? Inside the Power of MeToo. Just in case you're not familiar with our events program, we strive to provide a window into the newsroom and to give you the stories behind the stories. So, for example, on Friday, December 1st, we will produce a podcast club event with Michael Barbaro. The podcast club started as a brown bag lunch for Time staff who are podcast aficionados. Then it became a closed Facebook group, and in July we launched the series. We've featured our best loved podcasts from WNYC, Gimlet Media, and BuzzFeed, and on December 1st we're going to turn to our very own podcast to talk to Michael Barbaro about what makes a good interview, the stories behind the successful podcast club, and all about empathy. Then on Saturday, December 16th, we're going to launch B-Sides, which is a new series exploring how journalists' obsessions, hobbies, and passions show up in their writing. So we're going to go to Will Short's Table Tennis Center, and masthead editor Carolyn Ryan and reporter Eric Bishop will participate. You're all invited to come play some table tennis and hear about private passions. But most of all, our events provide a space for our readers to engage directly with our journalists. Tonight's event really exemplifies what we're hoping to do. This is our first event with Jessica Bennett, who's our new gender editor. She will lead the discussion with Amanda Hess, a David Carr Fellow and technology reporter, and Jenna Wortham, a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine and co-host of Still Processing, on technology's role in the continuing conversation about sexual harassment and assault. So I'm really happy that you're here, I'm really happy they're here, and I'm gonna turn it over to them.
Hello. Yay.
Hi, guys.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. So I know that yesterday was International Men's Day. I don't know if people knew this. It's a real holiday. It's not actually just every day. So I'm glad that you could make it out today, recovering from whatever it was you did to celebrate. Anyhow, we're not here to talk about men. We are here to talk about men, but in a different context. So I want to give us a little historical perspective. So I was doing a piece a couple of weeks ago where I came across this Ms. magazine cover from 1977. It was exactly 40 years ago this month, where they put sexual harassment on the cover for the first time. And it was, in fact, the first time that any magazine had put the words sexual harassment on a cover. The cover, they were illustrating this, and they didn't quite know how to do it without ruffling feathers, so they used puppets instead of people. There's a man's puppet hand grabbing a woman's breast. And yet it was still banned from supermarkets. So 40 years later, here we are, and it feels like one after the next. You know, we're scrolling on our phones backstage being like, have we missed anything? Mm-hmm. The dominoes are continuing to fall one after the next. And hashtag MeToo has been behind all of this, a way that, you know, millions of women at this point have been able to share their stories. And in fact, it's been translated into other languages, including French. I prefer their version of it, which is out your pig. I'm not going to pronounce it because I'll pronounce it wrong, but anyhow. So with you ladies, to what extent is what we're seeing now, which appears to be men, you know, one after the next falling very publicly and very swiftly, to what extent do you think this hashtag or social media's influence has impacted this or led us here?
I mean, I think society and technology are really linked, so it's hard to understand whether it's a technological innovation or like a societal change. I think it's probably both at the same time. Mm-hmm. But I'm a little bit less optimistic about like a hashtag solving everything. Mm-hmm. I think it's done something, which was use some of the participants, some of the women who came forward against Harvey Weinstein to push the conversation forward and widen it to, you know, other groups of people. But the whole Me Too like meme has been around for years and years before Harvey. So I do think sort of uncomfortably there's something about very famous, like mostly white actresses coming forward, like A-list stars, that has sort of changed people's perspective on this. That was, to me, like the most powerful thing to push it forward.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with all that. I also think that social media has started a culture of accountability where when things start to gather momentum, it's hard to ignore them. And mostly via the media cycle, like the news cycle, it's, you know, any hashtag can be a news story. So I think that has helped in the sense that's where reporters and TV news anchors and, you know, talk show hosts look for content. And so the fact that this is trending helps push it into a larger mainstream conversation. But I agree with Amanda that we're still seeing certain stories be prioritized and certain stories not get, you know, raised to the top. Mm-hmm. And that's really problematic. And also you think about, I mean, Twitter feels universal, but it's not. And it's very privileged, and you have to be able to have the kind of job where you can be online all day, which is a pretty rarefied group of people. I mean, none of us in this room, but for the most part, you know, if you just think about the people that have access to that and who's using it. So I think as I'm watching a hashtag like MeToo get momentum, I'm grateful for the ways in which, you know, I think men or people who aren't aware the degree to which most women have encountered this kind of abuse, they see how prevalent it is. I'm really grateful for the way it's pushed the conversation forward in that sense, but I also feel like we can't ignore the things that I might be missing or stuff that we still have to look at.
What can you tell us the backstory of Me Too? Because it, you know, we talk about the internet as the great equalizer or whatever, but it's still, like you mentioned, it was a hashtag started by a working class black woman years before that was then retweeted or reused years later by a famous white woman, Alyssa Milano, and suddenly it took off.
Yeah. I mean, I think it kind of works both ways where, because, I mean, I didn't know about MeToo before the Weinstein stuff happened. So we have then sort of been able to like go back and take a breath and learn about the history of it, which I think has been helpful and instructive. But for the most part, yeah, like the focus of a lot of the reporting, the stuff that, you know, some of the social media stuff feeds into is famous people. And we've had some stories about people who, you know, more working class women who've experienced this stuff. There was a story in the Huffington Post about maids and how often they experience like men like Louis C. Gang in their hotel rooms. And about women in the restaurant industry, in the food service industry. But those stories are like, here's a trend story about a huge industry. The stories about famous men are like, Charlie Rose did these very specific things, you know. Those men are sort of taken down one by one and sort of forced out of their positions. So there's this imbalance right now in how that is happening. And I think that the next step is to like understand how like we can respond to this in a sustainable way. We can't have the New York Times, the Washington Post, like picking off every single person as like much as I appreciate that when it happens.
I mean, it's hard to know, like, I think about this a lot. To what extent do we report on every story? And to what extent, you know, we can't only report on the stories of famous people. So then what do you do if you're a working class person that doesn't have access to media? In some sense, it feels like maybe Me Too is an outlet, but I'm not sure. How do we elevate the voices of those who may not be well-known, famous white actresses?
I mean, this is always a challenge and a question. Like, do people care when it's not famous people? Do people care when it's non-white people? Do people care when it's non-cisgendered people? I actually don't know, because I think, you know, it's our job as journalists to make people care, but it's really frustrating to feel like the circumstances that would make it safe for other people beyond Gwyneth Paltrow to come forward don't exist, because we haven't really seen that. Like, very rarely. Lupita wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about her experiences, and Tracy Lissette wrote something on Facebook that came out. Ellen Page did too. But, you know, they're still in the minority and probably the most vulnerable of those populations. And it feels really frustrating to feel like the news cycle is driven by these flashy marquee names. Not that those stories aren't important, but it feels like it's still prioritizing really specific stories. So I don't know what we do about that. I mean, I guess that's our job, but it's a disturbing trend.
I feel like in all these conversations, there's sort of this thing hanging over, which is like anger to some extent.
I'm so angry. I told you this before. I was like stroking a bundle of eucalyptus that I bought earlier because I'm just so salty. Like, I'm so mad.
And like exhausted potentially too.
I'm not yet.
You're not.
I mean, there's been all
like,
these.
More.
There's been like all of this like concern that the backlash is coming, and the backlash always comes. Like, it's always there. But I think for me, you know, just speaking for myself, like, I'm ready to keep hearing these stories. I'm like not tired of it yet.
What about you?
No, I'm like more. But I also need more mental health care too, because I'm just stressed. And I think, you know, it also makes you excavate and relive, and stuff resonates. And then you sit and you think about, well, I had this one moment, like, you know, it just brings up so much to the surface. And I think about young reporters that I know that have dealt with things that aren't quite as extreme, but still were really traumatic. And like, was I a good enough ally and friend to them? And it's exhausting personally. And I feel like, once again, women are bearing the majority of this labor. It's like, we have to be the ones to come forward. We have to be the ones to support each other. Like, it's just, that wears me out, because the onus is still on women to come forth with their stories. And it's not clear, if you're not a celebrity, or you're not targeting, or you're not like talking about someone who is in a position of power, what's going to happen? Like, your life gets ruined for what? Like, we're not, I mean, I know we'll talk about this later, but I'm still like, the system is still all in place. Like, the machinery is still running like clockwork. We're just at this point talking about specific parts of it. And I think I'm eager to see the aperture like broaden. Like, I'm eager to see this get bigger than just like, gasping, like clutching our pearls, that it turns out like, yes, all men, you know, not really, but you know what I mean? Like, I think I'm ready for, I want there to be as much of a pool for this to happen, because talking about these stories and all these incidents are so important. But I'm just also like, this needs to keep happening while parts A through D start to happen. And what do those look like?
Yeah. I mean, coming forward publicly about like the worst thing that ever happened to you should not be the cost, right, to women. And the New York Times like can't be the HR department for the entire country.
For society.
But then when you think about like who is running the country, it's like, is it going to be solved that way? Not right now, you know.
Right. Well, and I mean, to some extent, we've been here. Like, there was a hashtag after the Access Hollywood tape, and you know, in the 90s, after the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings, reports to the E.E.O.C, which at that time people used. I don't know if people these days even attempt to report to the E.E.O.C, but they went up 73%. And then, you know, nothing happened, and Donald Trump got elected. So, do we think this time is going to be any different? Are you hopeful?
It feels different. Things feel different to me. Things feel different. And I don't know yet how to quantify it, and I don't know yet how tangible it is, but I do think we're having we, as in me and my peer group, we're having a very different kind of conversation about what is tolerable, what is acceptable. I feel like anger feels very visceral. It feels very appropriate. I feel like, you know, not all men, but a lot of men I know who are powerful, and I'll just speak about my industry, like in media, are saying like, well, what can we do? And that feels exciting to me, and it feels new. And I feel like that even that people are thinking differently, that we're sort of looking at history a little bit, you know, just being like, oh yeah, there was this moment or was this thing, like that feels important hyper locally to me. And I don't know for these other big industries what will change or what needs to change, but in my immediate circles, I'm feeling a sense of discourse that feels valuable and hopefully is not ephemeral.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is definitely the first time in my lifetime where I felt like that, but I sort of wonder if this needs to happen for like every generation.
Mm-hmm.
Because before this, I sort of, you know, my friends and I had stories, but the idea of sexual harassment was something that was like on a weird videotape we had to watch when we started work, and it was like a big joke or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that was it. So I do wonder if this is just sort of like, you know, our moment. And I'm worried about what happens like when the stories stop coming, what we do after that.
Yeah, what do you think we do? And do you worry about fatigue? Because, you know, media fatigue, even if the New York Times can't be the HR department, what happens? Is there reader fatigue? Is there backlash? What are you thinking about that?
I mean, I think with celebrities, again, like, this isn't a good thing, but because it feels like gossip, I think there's always going to be an appetite for what famous men have done. I don't know how to translate that to people whose names we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Jenna?
Oh, no.
You don't have to.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. I mean, I don't have anything else to add. That was good.
So, Amanda, you wrote a piece this week about whether it's possible, and I know you have a clear point of view on this, to separate art from artist. And on Still Processing, in the last episode before you come back, you and Wesley Morris, your co-host, were talking about this. And he made what I thought was an amazing point about, you know, we think about where the food we put into our body comes from. We think about what chemicals are in our makeup, and we think about where our clothes were sewn. But we don't do that when it comes to art, and maybe we should. So, is it possible to separate those things? Should we be? Jeffrey Tambor in particular, I love Transparent. I am very sad that I need to, you know, sort of grapple with this now.
Yeah. I mean, that show is like about the things that he is accused of doing in a way that I think makes that like complicates the show, but I don't think it ruins the show for all of the other like wonderful people who are working on it. But Wesley's point is like really well taken, where for some reason we don't see art as part of the economy, as an industry, as something that is ruled by these same power dynamics. In fact, we romanticize power differentials in art. Like the auteur is like the director who has complete and total control over his artistic vision, which in like a workplace setting is horrifying, obviously, right? Like nobody wants to have to work for him, and like hundreds of people are in every movie. So yeah, I don't think we can separate them. And in fact, like I think that's one of the places where we have a lot of leverage to make change in that specific industry, because everybody is sort of relying on their critical acclaim or whatever. Introducing like their actions into our assessment of that, I think, can be like a powerful way to say that it's not acceptable.
And what about through history? You had a few interesting points. I mean, like, there are, and I feel like I should know this on some level, like Picasso was awful to women. Norman Mailer stabbed his wife, girlfriend?
I think his wife, yeah.
So there's like awful things that, you know, have been sort of forgotten, or like, I didn't remember.
Yeah. I think it's almost easier to deal with history because it's something that we have distance from. Like nobody's hanging out with Norman Mailer at parties anymore, you know? I actually got this voicemail. I get like the craziest voicemails, but I got a voicemail from a guy after I wrote this piece about how you can't separate the art from the artist. Like 100 guys emailed me and were like, what about Wagner, you know? Or like the guy on the voicemail was like, what about Norman Mailer? And I'm like, what about Norman Mailer? Like, I'm not gonna, it's not my job to like fix your relationship with every person. But I tend to find that like, I don't know, to me, art is more interesting when you understand where it came from. And it's not like those guys are like necessarily doing a great job of like hiding it. You know what I mean? Like you can tell what their attitudes are about women. So I think it's always been there.
I'm also casting like a real hard side eye though at everyone who was in that Louis C.K. movie, and also like the new Woody. Oh my gosh, Woody. Why am I blanking?
Woody Allen.
Thank you. I'm trying to like wipe it off from my brain. But like the new Woody Allen movie, I went to see a movie this morning with Wesley, and they played that trailer, and I was just like flipping it off, and he was just like, "You can't do that in here," and I was like, "I'm just salty. Like I'm angry today." But you know, it's like I feel like we should hold those actors and directors and people accountable. Like what message are you sending by like, and I don't know. I mean, look, I work for money too, and I know it's hard to say no to a project that can bring you more prestige and more spotlight. But I also think in this contemporary moment, I don't want to wait to look back on something too. Like I want to hold everyone accountable that worked on Transparent, and I want to hear more stories about what it was like to be there. And I feel like I love that show. I love Arrested Development. It's the same thing with R. Kelly. Like I can't play it anymore. Like I just have to let it go. And for me personally, it feels like a question of like, it all feeds into a culture of permissibility. Like if it's okay that this woman is speaking out about her experiences on Facebook, and then we're still gonna like line up for the next season of the show without holding them accountable for what are the standards like on set though? What are you making it? Are you creating an environment where it feels okay to violate a trans woman's personal boundaries? Like I need to know that if I'm going to support your product. And we live in a time when what people say about a show and what people, you know, how much we consume or contribute or share it contributes to how much more it's out there and propagated. So I feel like we have to put our money where our mouths are, or whatever. It's like we have to kind of do the thing that shows displeasure and a lack of support for conditions around the things that matter to us. And I think we do have a lot more power now as consumers because of social media, whether or not it contributes to someone's salary or whether a show like Transparent continues to live on, whatever. But saying like, oh, we're not going to support this show if these are the conditions that you guys are okay with, like that actually does matter. And it means something, I think, to a woman like Tracy to know that people care that she was violated on set. And I want her to know that personally. Like that's how I'm feeling right now as someone who is a hyper consumer of all these things. Like how do I show that I don't want to be a part of this larger system that says this behavior is okay because your product is popular and we're all still watching it anyway. Like that's something that's really sitting with me.
And well, it seems in the social media conversation, so okay, Me Too has largely been for sharing and sort of showing this collective nature of it. But Drop O'Reilly at the time actually got sponsors to drop him. And so that felt like real concrete action in a sense. And I don't know, it doesn't feel like we do that with art as much. Amanda, you talked about crazy voicemails that you get. You also wrote a really amazing piece a couple of years ago about what it's like to be a woman on the internet. And I thought you could talk about your experience a little bit, because I think that the emotional labor required of just existing as a woman who is on the internet is huge. And it comes in addition to everything else that you have to deal with.
Yeah. I mean, I think like every woman here probably knows what that is like. But I mean, I had an experience recently, to speak a little bit out of turn, where the New York Times has new guidelines for how to reply to reader mail. And the general guideline is like, you reply to everything. And I'm like,
oh, I missed that memo. What? I'm not doing that.
They made it. Okay, so they made an exception for like obviously like vile or like just like truly mean things. But I get a lot of emails from men who like just want my time and attention in a way that like I don't think they have earned or deserve. And I get a lot of that. I mean, obviously, like I've gotten like threats and stuff and all that bad stuff. But lately, I've been thinking more about just like the amount of time that men like expect from me there. And that's like, and it's not necessarily just there, it's like on the street too, but the internet is where like, you know, I interact with randos and I get a lot of that, and I've been sort of like salty about that recently.
Salty, theme of the yeah. Jenna, what do you do? Lindy West, who is a columnist for the opinion section of the Times, and is the author of a book called Shrill, and is generally very active on social, but she quit Twitter recently. It was like too much. She was like, I'm out. Do you ever think about that?
I don't know if I get that much. I mean, I'm editing this as I talk, because it's funny, because now that I do the podcast, we do talk a lot about race and gender, and it's a lot more off the cuff and raw, and I think people do respond, but it's interesting. I mean, like Amanda, I've been working online for a long time, so I think I've sort of skimmed stuff, and if it feels triggering, or like I just don't really engage with it. I mean, I usually will be like, thanks for listening, thanks for reading, like, you know, I try not to really engage too much, and it's never really super critical or personal, so I don't feel like I'm as targeted in a way that is untenable or unsustainable, but I'm not devoting a lot of energy to it. And I think it's easy to like just kind of let your eyes glaze over the stuff that feels really bad. But quitting Twitter is not an option for me. I mean, I don't know what would happen if I just quit Twitter. Like, I don't know what my job would say. So, and I get a lot of my news from Twitter, and I also rely on Twitter and other forms of social media, to be honest with you, to show me things that are being overlooked by mainstream media. So I don't feel like I can afford to. But if you're asking, like, how do you care for yourself when you're dealing with being a woman on the internet? I mean, I just have a very healthy offline relationship to myself and my own self-worth, and I spend a lot of time decompressing offline, more so now because I'm just generally kind of feeling devastated all the time. So that's a big part of my just life ritual, like just spending time taking care of myself. But I also think that leaving these systems is not the answer either, although everyone should do exactly what they need to do to feel well and to be well. Like, I always support that, but I'm also like, at what point do we start holding Twitter accountable? Like, at what point do we start holding Facebook accountable? And at what point do we start understanding that they're also perpetuating systems of abuse and harassment, and like looking at that, because they profit off of that too. They profit off of all that stuff. So, and we kind of have that conversation, but like, where are the Twitter campaigns against Twitter? You know, I mean, it's that kind of like, the call is always coming from inside the house, next level of dialogue that I'm excited to see happen. I mean, I can't start it because I'm a journalist, but someone here should. But you know what I mean? Like, that's sort of what I'm thinking about.
You wrote this really amazing piece that I want to call out about a year ago, I think, about the toll that what is happening in the world takes on Black bodies and the emotional toll. It feels like that could relate to this moment in time. And I think that the woman you talked to for the piece had actually looked at these studies that found that it was similar, or you could liken it to environmental pollutants. Mm-hmm. Like that was the same type of toll that something like racism could take on your body. So what about now? Like it's a lot. Like we don't talk about this generally as journalists, like we're just reporting the story, but it's a lot to be dealing with this in our own lives as well as in our work lives, covering it. What do you do? How do you cope?
Oh, me?
Or if you want.
I mean,
how do you feel?
I like work out. I don't know. Not enough. I mean, my main problem with Twitter right now is like I read it too much. It's not what people are saying. It's like just the volume, like the amount of time. So like I try to turn it off. But if my boyfriend is watching this, he'll be like, she never does. But that's something that I've been like thinking about doing.
It's true. I think we're not yet accustomed to what it feels like to absorb this much content all the time. And it's not just push notifications, although that's a big part of it. Like I want to attach like a heart rate monitor or something so I can see if there's a spike when I get a push alert, because I'm always like, oh my God, what's next? And, I think we'll look back on this time. We talk a lot about how the OJ trial was consumed and reported on as like the first instance of a 24-hour news cycle, and I have no idea what we'll say about this moment, but I think there'll be similar analogies drawn. But I always feel like there needs to be like a internet FDA, like, or like a we have like levels for how much lead is bad, like there's too much dirt in the water. We need that. We need like those toxicity. Someone needs to like, I don't know, take samples and like figure out like, okay, after 35 minutes you might start to feel queasy, like take a step back, go for a walk, like all the copy that runs below new drug ads, and they're like, side alert, you may start to feel weird after, whatever. Right. I think we need that for social media, and I think we need to be more honest about what it means to ingest bad news, like on a very hyper regular system. And I don't know, I think about that a lot. And the way it also feels so urgent, like everything feels like you must be paying attention, and we do pay attention because we're this is what we work in. So it's been really relentless. And I think a lot about, I spend so much time thinking about the psychology of social media and mental health, because I just feel like we're not, our culture is not, we just don't have systems in place to think about health in that way and taking care of, like we know to eat and sleep and like drink water, but we're not talking about like, look at the color blue for 20 minutes because it actually will calm you down. Like we just don't have those conversations. Or smell orange, there was a study out recently that it does lower stress levels and reduce like PTSD like symptoms. So everyone should get orange essential oil. We're feeling kind of stressed, rub some on your hands, just breathe in. But stuff like that should be more common knowledge, because we don't have natural, remedies for modern life.
When you were doing that piece, did the woman who was sort of taking you along for this teach you anything? What types of things was she doing?
Stuff like that. I wrote that piece because I was suffering from pretty chronic and wild anxiety that was manifesting itself in like eczema and like rashes. Like I was really freaking out, and I thought I was having a food allergy, and my acupuncturist was like, maybe it's stress. And I was like, what? And it was right after the election, and I was like, yo, I'm so stressed out. And so I'd already had a pretty natural, like a pretty good relationship with understanding what I put into my body and how it affects how I feel and how I move and how I think and how I sleep. And that got me thinking a lot more about environmental factors or social factors, and like social media as a factor. And so I think basically the lesson was just like, we have to understand that these things can be as toxic as cigarettes or can be as toxic as eating McDonald's. And sometimes you still do it because those fries are good, but like you have to also be aware of the way it's going to impact you and figure out how to counteract that and manage it too.
I think this is obvious for like people who write about the internet, but I think it's true for everybody. Like our jobs are all the time now. And so Twitter completely profits off this fear that if we're not on the internet, like something bad is going to happen. We're going to have to like clean up a mess with our company or our reputation or whatever. I remember when I applied for my job, I had an interview with Dean Baquet, who is the editor of the New York Times, and he asked me how much time I spent on the internet. And I was like, I don't understand what
Like,
you're
like,
that question. Like, how much time do I sleep?
right.
Subtracted from
That's
24
what I
hours a day. It was really funny. But yeah, Twitter is completely profiting off of, like, I think my fear that if I get a notification, it's not even like, what nice thing is my friend saying about me on Twitter? It's like, did I say something wrong at this panel that I'm on, and now everybody's mad, and I have to like check it out and figure out what's going on, and then it's just like somebody liked a tweet that I made like 3 days ago.
We checked backstage if it was going to be live streamed, and it was. So now we're edited.
Yeah.
So, what do you think the role of men is in all of this? Like, you know,
Lead.
guys,
No, I'm
there's
just
some
kidding.
here.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, like bystander intervention. I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
what do you think?
I mean, I think that's a big question because a lot of the guys that we've seen being accused of this stuff are the guys who are like so progressive, like so interested in helping women, etc., and have in some cases like used that role to shield themselves from accusations or to like create opportunities to offend. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to do with them right now.
I will say, like, I've actually had a couple of really encouraging conversations with men friends of mine who've been like, you know, how do I talk to other men? Like, I feel like people are starting to have conversations where they think about their roles as mentors. And I mean, again, speaking just to my industry, but like, how do I talk to other men in this industry about what is and isn't okay? And I think that is encouraging because it's sort of, again, like taking some of the onus off of women to be the sole, you know, instigators or catalysts of change. And I think that's really important because those, I mean, for better or for worse, like those men are still primarily the ones who are in positions of power, have hiring power, are making decisions about what newsroom or, I don't know, like workroom environments are going to be like. And I think that kind of consciousness is really important. And it doesn't matter if you're married to a woman or have a daughter. It's like you have to be actively ensuring that the most vulnerable people that you're in charge of feel safe and like asking them, hey, are you okay? What is your experience like? Do you feel safe here? I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that has to start happening. And also, I mean, I'm encouraged as devastating as it can be to see the proliferation of hashtags like MeToo and how far and wide it goes. It feels good that men are understanding too that it's not just limited to a certain number of women. It's like most women have dealt with this, with rare exception. Like most women have dealt with some form of harassment and sexual assault and abuse. So what are you going to do to make it okay for other women to talk about it and also try to prevent it from happening? Like, I feel like that's what needs to happen.
Do you think that sort of this tension between individual consequences, so, you know, calling for Al Franken to resign, versus cultural change, like, is one more important than the other? Do we need both? It was interesting. One of our colleagues, Nellie Bowles, wrote a piece out of Silicon Valley last week in which she interviewed all these men who were like, we don't know what to do now. And did we harass someone? And there turns out there are courses in Silicon Valley, this is going to shock everyone, but not really, that are like, here's how you mentor without harassing. Mm-hmm. And it's like remedial education in some sense. And that to me was so like unsurprising and surprising at the same time, because it's like reteaching in some way how not to harass. Like, mm-hmm. Is that what is necessary, do you think?
I mean, I see, to the extent that we can trust what any man accused of this stuff says, there is this pattern of like a lack of empathy where they're saying, you know, oh, I thought this was consensual, or I didn't, you know, from my perspective it was different, or I never realized that this was hurting people or offending them. Part of that rings true to me because it feels like some of these actions are undertaken by people who have never thought about how a woman feels or how another person thinks about their actions. So I think, yeah, I mean, maybe that's helpful. The thing that I struggle with is, like, the call for people to be fired, I think is completely understandable. But at least, like, in our industry, like, I've seen people, like, fired from jobs and then they get another job. Mm-hmm. And there is this, like, there was some, they took a hit personally, but there's nobody who's, like, accountable for them other than themselves, and they've shown themselves to be unaccountable. And there's, like, no process by which, like, any of that accountability or, like, retraining is taking place. So I'm worried about that, about how we can fix that.
Yeah, and also our attention spans are short for this kind of thing. Like, exactly what Amanda's saying is, I think, you know, it'll be very interesting to do a check-in in like 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, 18 months, and sort of be like, well, who got rehired? Like, so who was promoted? Like, who got a book deal? You know, because I think it's more likely than not that men fail upwards. I mean, they're out for a little bit, or it's like, it's frustrating when it's someone who's already had so much success and like bought a home, like bought 2 homes and 3 homes, and like they've made lots of money, and now their like reputation is tarnished, and like obviously that sucks too. But I'm just like, you benefited from all this bad behavior, or benefited in spite of all this bad behavior, and now we're slapping you on the wrist and like you're like a person non grata. But what does that actually mean? And are you even like, I think the accountability has to come earlier. And I think my hope is that we'll continue to sort of maybe keep problematic people under investigation or out of workplaces or whatever, and then also figure out, okay, well, how do we, I don't know, like I was thinking about this on the way here. It's like, do we start doing a different kind of background check? And it can't just be men. That's the other thing too. It's like, we have to figure out better ways of like looking at everyone that goes into a workplace and like who gets into positions of power. And it just feels like a lot of work that nobody wants to do. And it makes me tired to think about that we just kind of come out of this moment and are like, I don't know, you know, like that's my biggest fear.
Yeah. We're going to go to some questions. There are microphones roaming. So if you have a question, raise your hand. A mic will come to you. A reminder that questions end in a question mark. And we're going to just give you guys a little break for a second.
I worked in an all-male office during the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings. And at the time, I just couldn't come out of my office because none of my colleagues believed Anita Hill. And so part of my criteria for what's going on now is, what would it be like for a woman in that kind of office now? And so I was wondering if you had any comment on that.
I mean, I haven't had that experience, but I mean, I have had an experience of like talking to some women in journalism, including like the place where we work, saying like, you know, I've been upset that the main reaction to all of this stuff that like women are speaking about very seriously, and like some men are too, has been like a lot of jokes, you know, like there've been a lot of jokes like in offices, in my office, in other offices, and so I don't know that that's gone away. I mean, I cannot imagine working in a place where I'm the only woman there. I just can't.
I mean, I think one difference is that now you would be able to log online and talk to other people. I mean, like, quite honestly, you'd be able to have this dialogue. And hopefully there aren't as many all-male dominated workplaces.
First of all, thank you. I'm enjoying the commentary, and I'm grateful for this convening. I listened to an interview the other day with Senator Gillibrand, and she was asked what she thinks. Like, did she think that President Clinton, should he have stepped down or been forced to resign after allegations came out against him? And she paused, and she then said, yes. And she then went on to compare what Clinton did with, of course, what it is clear that Trump has done. But I'm curious what each of you think. I mean, should Bill Clinton have resigned or been forced to resign? And if so, what impact would that have on the climate today?
my hope would be that we just saw this happen, but the things that people knew that he did, or it was said that he did before he ran for president, would disqualify him. That would be my hope today.
I mean, it's tough because of what we're seeing now. But I think it certainly would have been dealt with differently. Like, people, the way that Monica Lewinsky was covered then, she was called a tart and all of these terrible names. And she, slut shaming was not a term used back then, but that's essentially what happened. And she will still say that was a consensual relationship. But I think we recognize now that the power dynamic was completely skewed. And I don't know if we had the literacy around these issues then to fully comprehend that. And I know certainly, I think I was in high school at the time, perhaps with you, asker of the question. Hi, Ellie. And I remember thinking sort of along those same lines, who was this woman? Not like, this is really screwed up.
Yeah, I think we're definitely looking back at the 90s with a much keener eye, with a much greater degree of scrutiny than we did when we lived through it. And that is really interesting to me. I think we're looking back at what, Ezra Edelman's documentary about O.J. Simpson, I think has been really interesting. I think recasting an eye back on Anita Hill has been really interesting. And I remember, I was really young at the time, but I remember thinking, she was a troublemaker. And I don't know, I've really been interrogating my memory, where did I get that idea? My parents both were government workers, and I don't think they said anything about it, but, I remember it being a tense time, and I didn't know why. And it was oh, this woman's causing trouble. And, history has kind of come around and been very, we see, at least for people who weren't adults back then or didn't have that consciousness back then, we're looking at that story in a very different light. And I think that scrutiny is really important. And I hope the same thing happens with Clinton and Lewinsky. It has happened a little bit. She's had a little bit of a moment, but I also feel like I want to really interrogate that, because it's all still informing what's happening right now in ways that we're oh, that was forever ago. No, it's still very much influencing and shaping events right now. And so I'm hopeful there's more of that.
Yeah, it's interesting too, and then we'll go to the next question, but at that time, feminists did not support Monica Lewinsky. They very much supported Clinton because he was the first person in so long to do things that were good for women's rights and put Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court, all of these things. And so there was no army or hashtag or community of people behind her, I think. And so I do think that's different now, and I think that there's a younger generation that just has a completely different understanding of nuance and as with respect to what's happening in this moment.
Hi. You had said that, and it made me laugh at the time, that the New York Times can't be the HR department for the entire country. And that's very funny, but it's also kind of what the responsibility of the media is, in a way, is to hold us accountable when we're doing something wrong and to call attention to it. And I kind of wonder why you said that. Why is that? Why isn't that your purpose? And why isn't that the Washington Post's purpose? And why can't it be your purpose? I've seen the New York Times grow section by section. I've used sexual harassment under civil liberties, and why can't that be a purpose? Why can't you be the HR department for the entire country, especially under this administration?
I think it's definitely a huge part of our mission and our purpose to cover those stories. But the New York Times doesn't have the bandwidth to cover everybody who's come out against Harvey Weinstein, one person. We just don't have not enough people work at the New York Times to cover every sexual harasser in every industry and every job, and we are particularly not going to have the bandwidth to cover people who we've never heard about. It's just not a sustainable option for everybody to be publicly named and shamed, to me. What I think we can do is offer paths for how that might happen. Like the op-ed page this week published a story by Sarah Leonard, who's a leftist journalist, that I thought was very interesting, and it was about how unions can play a role in fighting sexual harassment in workplaces. I mean, the problem with that is that unions are weaker than they have ever been as well. But I've been like heartened to see the conversation sort of move toward like these social and systemic solutions. Like we just literally, even if every reporter's job was to cover sexual harassment, like we could not cover everything.
And the rigor to which the New York Times does it, for what it's worth. Like, people on the record, 3 corroborations for each. Those corroborations need to be on the record. Like, it is a rigorous and tedious and important process. And why everyone here should subscribe to the New York Times.
Well, I was going to say, too, I mean, the New York Times still reaches a very specific audience. I mean, it still caters to a very specific audience. And not everyone, I mean, I have family members who don't believe things in the New York Times. I mean, they also voted for Donald Trump, but like it's not, it can't be the end all be all. Like, it should be a big part of our mission moving forward, but it has to be bigger than what certain publications' priorities are, because not everyone believes what they read. And, it's like we're seeing this whole year that news can feel very biased. And so for me, it's like, yes, obviously this is a huge priority and like one of the biggest stories, if not the biggest story of the year, but it also can't just end at reporting. Because then what happens when the next big crisis happens?
So this question is more for the moderator, and maybe the panelists have some thoughts. This conversation is great to have with women as panelists, but I'm just wondering why there are no men on the panel.
Well, I think that, so I struggle with this a lot in rooms like this, because there are a few men here. I see them. Thank you for being here. It's mostly women. Most of us have probably had an experience like this. So to some extent, are we preaching to the choir? Yes, like this is an echo chamber. I also think that it is very important for institutions like the New York Times to elevate our amazing female voices that often don't get elevated, and to showcase them. And specifically with regard to this topic, we're talking about the internet and its role in this. And these are our 2 most prominent internet critics at the Times. So I think that it's important to showcase female voices. I also think it is important to have men in these rooms.
You had a question.
Yeah.
Do you still have it?
Yeah. Thank you. My question is about Louis C.K.'s response to his accusations. And I would just, I don't want to give my thoughts on it. I would love to know all of your thoughts on it, and whether you felt it changed the narrative, if it impacted, if it kind of took that power away from them by kind of, I'll let you say what you think your thoughts were on that response from him.
I thought there were, I mean, I don't know. There was a general sense that it was a very well-groomed response that primed him, or would put him in a position for redemption or some sort of path to recovery in a few years. And I think that felt really, I hadn't actually considered that, and I thought that felt really appropriate. Like, I was really disturbed by that notion that, like, he's kind of playing a role and, was doing this thing, got caught, got called out, and now is sort of already pre-repairing his reputation. And I think that was really, I'm still processing, that's the name of the show, but I'm still, sorry, plug, no. But I'm still thinking about what that means and what it really means to have something that's so systemic, so accepted, and so ingrained that someone might possibly already be planning for their comeback, even as they're in the midst of a pretty, I mean, it can't get any bigger or wilder or crazier than that type of, moment. Your film is canceled, basically. I don't know. So you probably have better answers than me, but I think I'm still really thinking about what that implication might mean.
Yeah, I mean, I was joking to my partner that he's like a woke harasser. Like, that was the response that was the best response that probably a feminist could ask for, but it was still fucked up. So it's
and
really...
like, what woman wrote that for him?
Mm.
You know,
Right.
but I'm serious
Yeah.
though. Like, I'm just like, someone read this. Who read this for you?
Right. And I'm interested in seeing like how these people come back and like watching the process. And I was reading the John Ronson book recently, So You Think You've Been Shamed. And it talks about people who have either been publicly shamed or committed some egregious, non-criminal but terrible crime, like Stephen Glass, who plagiarized and made stuff up. And then kind of the nuance of their response, whether they owned it or they denied it or they just were like, yeah, I don't care. And then how the community and culture responded to that. So I'm curious to see going forward, like how, whether we forget about these things, whether these people are able to come back, like how that plays out.
I mean, not to give him any credit personally, but I appreciated that the statement said that all of the stories are true, because I think that's a big thing that we've been fighting for, is just this acknowledgement of our reality. Like, I don't know how the women involved feel about it, but that to me was significant. I mean, it doesn't make up for, by all accounts, him not just doing these things, but lying about it for years and years. But to me, like, the acknowledgement that these things happened is a meaningful thing to say. The rest of the statement I can, like, do away with. But.
I know I still don't like question marks, but I actually am really curious what your take is.
The reaction, like, based on like what people were saying on Twitter and like in real life, was like, oh, that was a pretty good response, which freaked me out, because I felt like he never said I'm sorry. Right. He acknowledged that they were true, but he never said, you know, but I apologize. And the fact that we were like, this is the bare minimum, is we've gotten a guy to say, yeah, I did it, and we're like, all right, we did something, we accomplished something. It's like, no, like you said, you know, this systemic, like, ingrained, like, that's what we accept now. Like, we're able to take this tweet or this response, and, you know, it just that it really disturbed me about how he was able to kind of take that narrative and kind of shift it away from them and their stories. And now we were not applauding, but almost like giving him credit for, admitting to this. I just felt like it was like pretty sick, honestly. But
I mean, he also had an opportunity to tell the New York Times that those things were true, and he declined to do that.
That's interesting.
So he like took his own moment. Yeah.
Hi, we're a row of educators. My question is, what do you feel is the best way to carry on conversations like this with students that are either age appropriate, or, to your point about celebrities don't sensationalize the names, but get to the teachable moments in regards to, right, if this is not the reality we want for our children, whether biological or in our classrooms, what role do we play in playing that forward?
Well, I mean, speaking as a journalist, not an educator, I think that often we talk about these things and we say we're going to have conversations with our daughters. And I think that we need to also have conversations with our sons. Like, this is a conversation that clearly needs to be happening from a young age. And actually, I think one of the undercovered stories about all of this is harassment that exists in elementary school, middle school, high school. Like, this stuff begins really early. And so I think oftentimes we wait until, college consent trainings or workplace sexual harassment trainings to have these conversations. And I actually think they need to start really early.
I definitely would have appreciated a space in school for everybody to talk about the stuff that was happening in school. And I don't even know if it needs to be tied in with anything else necessarily. But yeah, I would have appreciated that too.
I think too, I've been privy to some convos that educator friends of mine and new parents friends of mine who've been talking a lot about what it looks like to teach children about consent from the time they're really small and ownership of the body. And I think in the US and some Western cultures, we just don't teach about having a relationship to our bodies and what that means. And, having those conversations very early on. I mean, when you're young, you're sort of told, like, don't let a stranger touch you in this way. But I think that gets confusing when you're in school or your classmates or your siblings, or like, what does that mean? And, letting kids decline hugs from relatives. If they don't want to hug a relative, that is okay, and I think, starting to understand that there are societal norms that make, and the way we socialize children into thinking that they do have to comply or don't have to comply. I mean, that's like the kind of stuff we have to really interrogate. And I think a lot about what it means to give little kids permission just to say no. Even though they're so cute to hug and like you want to hug them, it's like I respect a baby that doesn't want to be picked up. I'm like, you know what? That's chill. Like, I don't need to grab your feet. Like, I get it, and I feel like that's where it has to start, actually.
And this stuff is so deeply ingrained, like I was interviewing a guy who is an expert in masculinity, and he started the first ever graduate program in masculinity studies at Stony Brook University. And anyway, we're talking about masculinity and these definitions of it and what is taught to boys at a young age and things like the word no. And, young men, I think, are taught that the word no from a woman just means try harder. And I think that is ingrained from a really young age. So I think that, like, just having these larger conversations and talking about, men and masculinity and boys and what all that means as well. You have a microphone.
Yeah, so going off of your earlier question about saying sorry, I think that how do we deal with, covering the nuance of saying sorry and saying sorry that I got caught? And adding that as in a second part of holding people accountable, not just accountable for what they did, but accountable for, they could have said sorry years ago. They also, I think, could have not done it. So how do we, cover that in the media, but also in a larger dialogue of, yeah, you said sorry, but it's still not good enough.
That's real.
I don't know. I mean, I also think like a lot of this is caught up in an idea, like a conversation we're not really having is like, can people be rehabilitated? How does that happen? Like, how does that happen outside of like jails and prisons? Or outside of workplaces or inside workplaces? Like, workplaces don't know how to do that. And nobody sort of has that role now except, I think, like for the prison system, which just like locks people away if they do something. So I don't know, but I'm someone who like believes that people can change and that people's whole lives should not be determined by the worst thing they do. I just don't know. I'm not totally sure where to go from there because I don't think we have any systems set up to do this stuff other than like if you're Kevin Spacey and you can pay like $1 zillion to go to like a spa to like learn how to not abuse people, we don't have that. So I don't know.
And the fact of the matter is, I think part of the reason why so much of this is happening publicly is because legal institutions aren't necessarily working when it comes to this, The definitions of sexual harassment in some ways are outdated. The Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, where we're supposed to file complaints, no one really goes there. If you ask a young woman today if she reported her complaint to the E.E.O.C, she's likely to say, what is that? And so I think that in some senses, women have used media and social media as an alternative to that. But I don't know what the answer is in terms of, changing the legal framework or even changing the policies inside institutions.
I mean, a lot of work also has to be done to raise the value of women because, thinking about this question about the distinction between, men who, like Clinton or Al Franken, right? My brain is like slow. It's Monday. Who, professionally have advanced women's rights or civil rights causes, but personally behaved really egregiously and ungraciously. It's like, well, that's because they were able to, I would imagine they were able to imagine a bigger picture good, but when it came down to an individual, they still didn't see them as equal or human, And so like, that's where that question comes into play, where like you can have a bigger picture about right and wrong, but then you're like, well, but in day to day, this is different. And I think that's where, because we still don't have language for talking about like racial microaggressions. It's like not a surprise that we don't understand what it means to mistreat a marginalized person or a marginalized group. It's like, of course not. Like there's nothing in the narrative, our pop culture, our societal, our legal, there's nothing in our narrative that places anyone on the value of white men. So why would they ever give a shit about anyone that's not themselves? You know, it's like that's part of the culture that has to change. And it just goes all the way down. And it's really depressing to think about, but it's also really important to think about because this will define our lifetime and our children's lifetimes. And hopefully their children's lifetimes might be a little bit different, but it's like the work has to happen now.
We're going to do one more question.
Hi. I was wondering whether you could speak about, it seems to me that as we're in week number whatever since this sort of started, that there are two different sort of bright, shiny objects that we're being lured to pay attention to, one of which is the kind of relitigating the past, the sort of what should have happened to Clinton. And then the other one being the where on the spectrum is somebody? Are they a criminal? Are they a creep? Are they just a product of their society? And I was wondering how you, what the strategies are to deal with focusing on the main issues as opposed to being lured down these paths, which in many ways are ways of reshaping the conversation so that it's more convenient, so that it's about, you know, like disrespecting the flag instead of taking a knee because of racial injustice. You know, I mean, so that kind of, that it seems to me to be kind of a similar strategy to kind of send us down these very specific paths.
I mean, for me, I think it's helpful to think about not the specific action that is alleged and how it might like be problematically conflated with a crime or whatever, but instead to think about like the effect that it has. What has the effect been on women in that workplace? For me, it's always like the most devastating part of these stories, maybe because I'm just like so used to them now, is never like the actual behavior, it's what happens after that. The woman who decided to quit the New York Times and go to a different workplace because she didn't want to deal with her boss anymore. Or the woman who said that she didn't really feel like pursuing comedy anymore after running with Louis C.K. The things that those people did may not be criminal, or they might be, I don't really know. But to me, it's really helpful to focus on like the harm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on a story now where I've been interviewing a lot of women, and one of them called this person in question a dream crusher because it is the dreams that have been squashed. You know, the woman who doesn't go on to be an actress or goes into a different field or isn't a writer or leaves comedy. And so I think that's a really good point.
And I think too, like we have to understand that these things do happen on a spectrum, they do happen on a continuum, and that we don't have to prioritize certain narratives because, you know, the abuse was worse. Like I don't think it's helpful necessarily, kind of what Amanda was saying, to sort of try to put things on a hierarchy, but understand they are all products of the same type of culture, and they all cause similar types of harm to varying degrees. And I think being able to have that conversation and not say, well, that man is just a dog. You know, it's like, no, we actually have to talk about what it means for the experiences of women to come out and for us to feel like, I don't know, that they do contribute to this broader, sense of oppression, more or less. Like, I think we have to be able to have all the conversations kind of at the same time and not say, well, we've got to distill it to, you know, a common denominator in order for it to be valuable. It's like all of it's valuable, and we have to be able to hold multiple thoughts in our heads at the same time. But I really appreciate that question because I'm thinking a lot about that right now too.
I mean, these things are all linked in some way, I think, like consent and harassment and women in power and leadership. And, you know, if we could solve the problem of not having women in power, then we could potentially solve this to some extent. Like the research shows that when you have women in leadership positions, harassment at those companies actually goes down. So it's very much intertwined, and I think we're thinking about all of those things. And now I'm sure you all want to go like take a shot of something because you know, this is dark, but we so appreciate you being here and continuing to read and continuing to talk about this, and I hope you'll do more. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for amazing panelists.
You guys are great.